Okay, off we go. Thank you very much, everyone, for being here today. And we have panelists all the way from lovely California. And we have an audience that is split between people living in Greece and people living in the United States, as well people from various European countries, which goes to suggest that the topic on which we're going to be talking about is not just any topic, but one that still resonates. 2,500 years and about 9 hours ago, we had one of those seminal events in world history. And it's one of those events where we can place it, we can locate it, specific day, specific time. It takes sometimes one single day to change the course of Western civilization. One may think that this is a grand statement, but I'm certain once we're done with all the presentations, we will realize that the Battle of Salamis is just not any other battle, but an event that 2,500 years later teaches us about democracy, about statesmanship, about democracy and warfare, about Greece and what the Greeks do, and the fact that so often in history, this part of the world has been a border region between what we can schematically call the East and the West. So without further ado, I would first like for Minister Zaharakis to take the floor. Let me just say that Minister Zaharakis has studied English literature at the University of Athens, has a graduate degree in comparative education, again from the University of Athens, has been an advisor to the Ministry of Development, has been deputy spokesperson and then spokesperson of New Democracy, and now holds the not easy portfolio of Deputy Minister of Education. Minister Zaharaki, the floor is yours. We might want...
Thank you.
Yes.
Professor Chaberis, let me just start by thanking you for this invitation.
Unfortunately, we had this technical snafu, but we're back. And Minister Zaharakis will join us through the phone, and then we'll move on to Dean Sfakianakis. But let me just, as we actually get the telephone connection, let me just make a little point out of what just happened. 2,500 years later, we have such technological tools in our disposal. We have internet, we have phones, cell phones, we can tell what the weather is, forecasts, and still we have problems. So imagine without all our fancy gadgets and tools and ability to deal with all these things, just imagine how more impressive the achievement at Salamis was. They had none of our fancy gizmos. They probably had much more humility though, and they succeeded. So if we can get Minister Zaharakis on the phone, I'd like us to do that now. If not, we'll move on to, I think we do. So Minister Zaharakis, sorry about this. It has to do with internet bandwidth. Imagine having a conference and talking about that when all of us were starting. And Minister Zaharakis, the floor is yours again.
Thank you very much, Professor Chaberis. I hope that everybody can hear me now. Yes?
Yes, we can.
Okay.
Loud and clear.
That's perfect. Okay, thank you very much for the invitation, and sorry for this communication breakup. Yes, it is indeed something that we can all, contemplate how they made it all happen. And we now have, all the gadgets and everything, and we still have, this ability to communicate the way we would wish. Anyway, I really would like to thank you again for the invitation, and really greet all the speakers. What an impressive group of speakers you have today, Professor, and the university, of course, and the council for holding this very interesting and very fruitful conversation. For us at the Ministry of Education, it has been a year of a lot of challenges. But at the same time, we were able to try and instill to our students, the motive and the drive to work on this amazing feat that happened 2,500 years ago. And it was just last week that we actually sent out a circular to all schools. And tomorrow they will devote 2 hours of the curriculum in learning more, in studying more about this amazing and impressive Battle of Salamis. And throughout the year, if it weren't for COVID, 2 very interesting competitions which have taken place. I think that we will be able to finish and accomplish, in delivering also the outcomes of these competitions, even online versions of them. So, for everyone that is now online, we all, acknowledge that 2020 has been, as we all know, rather a turbulent year. But as we before mentioned, it also marks the 2500th anniversary of the Battle of Salamis. And to say that 400 BC was for the Athenians or the United Greek allies not just a turbulent year would be a gross understatement. And for the space of less than a year, the Greek allies had fought heroically and yet had been decisively defeated in the Battle of Thermopylae. The Persians had moved forward, conquering and burning Athens to the ground, and forcing the Athenian population to seek refuge in Salamis and beyond. And for all intents and purposes, it seems the desperate moment for the Greek allies, and especially for the Athenians, because they had lost the battle, they lost their homeland, and they were unable to contain the Persian advance. But also it seems that there was anything, literally anything, in the way of the Persian troops that could stop the subjugation of Greece to the Empire of Xerxes. So how distant, would the triumph of Marathon would have seemed right at the moment? Still, and despite having lost almost everything other than their fleet, the Athenians decided to make their stand and fight at Salamis and on the sea, at the island that they knew very well, being the nearmost to the fallen homeland, and on the waves which they also knew very well, on which they would later build the power of the Athenian state. And it was a decision full of risks. Now the rest, as the saying shows, is history. And on the day that Persia was defeated and classical Greece was saved, more battles had to be fought and Platyas and elsewhere until the war was won. But the tide had irrevocably turned. And I think that if it is often said quite correctly that history is not written with what ifs, but it is also true that we cannot help but wonder what would have happened had the Greeks been defeated at Salamis, and what the repercussions be not just for the development for the civilization of classical Greece, but for the history of humanity. It is therefore undoubtedly one of the most important events recorded in history. And I think that there is also another takeaway from this battle. It is the courage which the desperate Athenians and the Greek allies showed in the face of adversity, despite the catastrophes that they had suffered, against an seemingly unstoppable enemy. And at a moment where all seemed to have been lost, they chose not to surrender, but make their stand and fight for their liberty, fight for their families, the way of life, the homeland, despite against our odds. Dear friends of this panel discussion, but also everybody who is now, joining us online, this year has presented us with unforeseen challenges. But nothing we face now can be compared to what the Athenians and the Greek allies were facing on the eve of the Battle of Salamis. And we should keep that in mind every time we feel the same, we feel the current sanitary crisis or indeed any future crisis is taking a toll on us. People have faced much more worse circumstances in history and emerged victorious. And we need to remember that our country in particular is not only, facing the COVID-19 crisis, but also things that have to do with international issues. But still, in this respect, the example of Salamis remains as important, as pertinent as ever. And we think that 2005 years after its conclusion, the Battle of Salamis is clearly recognized as one of the most iconic moments in world history, and it offers us a unique opportunity to us and, of course, our students to dwell on the lessons we can draw from it. And with these remarks, Aris, I would like to turn to you for the coordination of this very important meeting.
Mr. Zaharakis, thank you so much. These were truly thoughtful comments. I have three major takeaways. One is, let's transport ourselves into time. And imagine us who are living in Athens right now, we have to leave our homes. We have to leave everything except some things that we can carry. We don't know what's going to happen. We have to fight for survival. The enemy has an empire that spans modern day from Pakistan to the Balkans to Egypt. The forces against us are probably at least 10 times bigger. And talk about turbulence. Compare that to the turbulent 2020, where we are forced to wear masks and not dart indoors. The magnitude of the challenge of the turbulence back then was just something completely different. My second takeaway is, and we might have a novel one day, is what if? Minister Zaharakis actually very presciently, I think, suggested, what if this battle had gone the other way? I think we would all agree, and I expect people to hear from our panelists, we would have had a very different world history than the one we've experienced, certainly as regards what we have come to call the West. And my third takeaway, which I'm going to steal, is that this is an iconic event in world history. So thank you very much. There's a lot of food for thought there. Thank you, Minister. And now I turn to Dean Sfakianakis, who is the dean of our school. And I have to say, for all the years that he's been dean, he has been immensely supportive of all our efforts, especially everything and anything that has to do with international cooperation. Let me also say that I have a special agreement with Dean Sfakianakis today. Although his English is beyond excellent, he is going to make a few remarks in Greek because I think he may have a surprise, and he just wants to make absolutely certain that in legalese, it is right. And I'll do my best to do a little translation. So, Dean Sfakianakis, the floor is yours.
Καλησπέρα σε εμένα. Είναι ιδιαίτερη η χαρά μου να συμμετέχω στο σημερινό webinar εκ μέρους του Πανεπιστημίου Πειραιώς και εκ μέρους του πρίτανη του Πανεπιστημίου Πειραιώς, ο οποίος έχει μια ανηλυμένη υποχρέωση και δεν μπορεί να παραβρίσκεται σήμερα μαζί μας. Έχετε τους θερμούς χαιρετισμούς του. Ξεκινώντας, θα ήθελα να πω και εγώ δύο λόγια για την ταυμαχία της Σαλαμίνας, την οποία τιμούμε σήμερα στο σημερινό webinar. Φέτος συμπληρώνεται 2.500 χρόνια, αν θυμάμαι καλά, ήταν το 480 από Χριστού όταν συνέβη. Και θυμάμαι από το δημοτικό τότε που μαθαίναμε, το δημοτικό σχολείο που μαθαίναμε ουσιαστικά την ιστορία, τη σημασία που μας είχαν πει οι δάσκαλοι μας τότε για αυτή τη μεγάλη νίκη, την οποία ουσιαστικά χρεώθηκε ο Θεμιστοκλής, πιστώθηκε μάλλον στο Θεμιστοκλή, γιατί ο Θεμιστοκλής ουσιαστικά ήταν αυτός που ουσιαστικά είχε την πολιτική ιδιοφυΐα και την εποχή και τη στρατηγός να σκεφτεί, να στρέψει στην ουσία και να δώσει βάρος στη θάλασσα. Η θάλασσα ουσιαστικά δεν είχε αξιοποιηθεί μέχρι το Θεμιστοκλή. Ο Θεμιστοκλής μπόρεσε και έπεισε τους Αθηναίους. Δώσανε ουσιαστικά όλους τους πόρους από τα μεταλλεία του Λαβρίου για να να φτιάξουν 200 τριήρεις, οι οποίες ναυπηγήθηκαν και ήταν αυτές και επανδρώθηκαν κιόλας. Μάλιστα, θυμάμαι τη λύση του κ. Πλατιά, ο οποίος έλεγε ότι κάθε τριήρης ήθελε 200 άντρες. Οπότε, στην ουσία, φανταστείτε ότι έπρεπε να αποπλήτες οι Αθηναίοι, να γίνουν ναύτες και μάλιστα εκπαιδευμένοι, και απαιτούνταν τουλάχιστον 40.000 εκείνη την εποχή ναύτες για να μπορούν να έχουν ουσιαστικά τη δύναμη να αντιμετωπίσουν τον πολυάριθμο περσικό στόλο.
Let me just stop you there for 1 second just to do a little translation. Dean Sfakianakis is actually today representing the rector of our university, who has an engagement he couldn't get out of. And he reminisced that when he was in elementary school, he was being taught, even back then, how important this was. And in many ways, this great victory is credited to Themistocles, to his political and military genius, and the fact that he emphasized the sea and convinced the Athenians to take their luck and their fortunes to the sea. And also their money. The basic funds from the Lavrion mines were spent to construct 200 triremes, and each one had 200 men, so that's 40,000 men. Basically, the polis, in terms of the male free citizens, were fighting on these triremes. Dinos Pakianakis.
Οπότε λοιπόν η ναυαρχία της Σαλαμίνας με την επιτυχή έκβασή της αποτελεί μία από τις σημαντικότερες νίκες στην παγκόσμια ιστορία. Θεωρείται ότι άλλαξε το ρου της παγκόσμιας ιστορίας και μπορούμε να πούμε ότι εάν αυτό δεν είχε συμβεί, η Αθήνα θα κινδύνευε να αφανιστεί από το χάρτη, όπως πολύ σωστά είχε επισημάνει ο φίλος και συνάδελφος ο Θανάσης Πλατιάς, όταν η Καρκιδόνα ιτήθηκε από τους Ρωμαίους, μετά από λίγο εξαφανίστηκε από το χάρτη. Επίσης, είναι προφανές ότι θα είχε υποδουλωθεί σταδιακά η υπόλοιπη Ελλάδα. Δεν θα υπήρχαν οι συνθήκες για να δημιουργηθεί ο Χρυσούς Αιώνας του Περικλέους, για τον οποίο ακόμα τα αποτελέσματά του ακόμα και σήμερα απολαμβάνουμε. Και πρακτικά θα μπορούσαμε να πούμε ότι ο δυτικός πολιτισμός, όπως τον ξέρουμε μέχρι σήμερα, χωρίς την ελληνορωμαϊκή επίδραση, δεν θα υφίστατο. Άρα λοιπόν, όλο αυτό μπορούμε να το πιστώσουμε, αν είμαστε δίκαιοι, στον μεγάλο στρατηγό, τον Θεμιστοκλή, ο οποίος ως πολιτικός ηγέτης της Αθήνας με ιδιοφυή στρατηγική σκέψη έστρεψε την πόλη του προς τη θάλασσα, δημιουργώντας το πρώτο ναυτικό κράτος ουσιαστικά στην παγκόσμια ιστορία.
Let me just interject myself here. So what we have, this is not just an important victory, but a turning point in world history. Had it gone the other way, this is an answer to what Minister Zaharakis said before, Athens would most likely have had the fate of Carthage. It would have been obliterated from the map. And that means we wouldn't have had the golden century of 5th century Athens with all its achievements, and a different history for Western civilization, if we would have had what we now call Western civilization. And for Dinos Pakianakis, if we have to credit one person and one person alone, that has to be Themistocles and his genius.
Η στροφή που οραματίστηκε ο Θεμιστοκλής προς τη θάλασσα είχε σαν συνέπεια τη μεταφορά του κέντρου βάρους της Αθήνας στον Πειραιά. Και μάλιστα το Πανεπιστήμιο Πειραιά, το οποίο αντιπροσωπεύουμε σήμερα, έχει την έδρα του στην καρδιά του στρατηγικού σχεδίου του Θεμιστοκλή, στο νεόριο της Ζέας, δηλαδή στο Μεσαίο, και ίσως σημαντικότερο κατά την αρχαιότητα από τα 3 λιμάνια που διαθέτει ο Πειραιάς. Ο Πειραιάς παράλληλα με τον Θεμιστοκλή είχε σαν απόρρια να έχει τα θεμιστόκλια τείχη και στην ουσία έγινε η καρδιά του ναυτικού κράτους της Αθήνας, και μπορούμε να πούμε ότι ο Θεμιστοκλής μετέτρεψε τον Πειραιά στο εμπορικό, στρατηγικό κέντρο της Αθηναϊκής Αυτοκρατορίας, αν μπορούμε να τη χαρακτηρίσουμε έτσι, η οποία κτίστηκε πάνω στο νικηφόρο αποτέλεσμα της ναυαρχίας της Σαλαμίνας. Όλα αυτά λοιπόν μπορούμε να πούμε το ότι αποτελούν μία πίστοση ιδιαίτερη στο μέγεθος του Θεμιστοκλή, που η στρατηγική και πολιτική ιδιοφυΐα του υμνήθηκε από πολλούς της αρχαιότητας. Μπορεί να αναφέρουμε τον Θουκυδίδη, τον Πλούταρχο και πολλούς άλλους. Άλλωστε, αυτοί που θα ακολουθήσουν εμένα είναι και πλέον ειδικοί για να τους αναφέρουν και να πιστοποιήσουν όλα αυτά τα παραπάνω που λέω. Εγώ θα ήθελα να πω ότι με ιδιαίτερη χαρά μπορώ να σας ανακοινώσω ότι η σύγκλιτος της 23ης Σεπτεμβρίου ξεκίνησε τις διαδικασίες για τη μετονομασία του Πανεπιστημίου Πειραιώς σε Θεμιστόκλειο Πανεπιστήμιο Πειραιώς, θεωρώντας ότι με αυτόν τον τρόπο θα αποτίσουμε φόρο τιμής σε μια από τις μεγαλύτερες ηγετικές μορφές της παγκόσμιας ιστορίας, η οποία συνδέεται με τον Πειραιά και εμέσως, πλην σαφώς, με το Πανεπιστήμιο Πειραιώς, που με την επίτευξη αυτού του στόχου θα ενδυναμωθεί και η εικόνα, το brand που λέμε, του Πανεπιστημίου Πειραιώς και στο εξωτερικό.
So Professor Sfakianakis actually just made a very important announcement. He said that basically with this victory in Salamis, Athens becomes first and foremost a naval state. And that changes the importance of the port of Athens, which is Piraeus. Piraeus becomes far more important because that's the port, actually 3 ports of Athens. And that's where the emphasis is now. And then he made a connection to the University of Piraeus today, which is only a few feet away from the most important port of ancient Piraeus. And we are fully cognizant of what has transpired in the past. For these reasons, the Senate of the University of Piraeus on September 23, 2020, that was a few days ago, started the process to rename the university from the University of Piraeus to the Themistoclean University of Piraeus, something that I think will not only, or he thinks does not only help with the branding of the university, but pays proper homage to one of the singular personalities of world history. So Dean Sfakianakis, thank you very much. This decision was taken late Friday. So you're basically the first person who's making a public announcement that the process, you were very careful in your words, is starting. Okay. Thank you. Yes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So that makes for very exciting news. And I'm actually really happy with the 2 introductory presentations because, well, usually they tend to be not that interesting, but both of them in different ways were actually very substantial. So thank you very much. So on we move now to our actual event. And we'll start with Professor Konstantina Botsou. Let me just say the following. I had in sharing this, I had the following problem. All our panelists have these long, distinguished CVs, and we could have spent 15 or 20 minutes just recounting their achievements, their publications, their positions. So they were, with a sense of humility, all of them just gave me a very, very, very brief CV, just some highlights from their impressive careers, and I appreciate they very much. But online, you can see the full scope of their accomplishments. Konstantina Botsou is Associate Professor and Director of the Center for Greek International History at the University of the Peloponnese, where she also served as Vice Rector. She is Visiting Professor at the Hellenic National Defense College and Director of the Council for International Relations Greece. She's a former Director and Vice President of Konstantinos Karamanlis Institute for Democracy. Her books include Greece's Course to Europe, from the Truman Doctrine until the association with the EEC, 47-1961, Europe between NATO and the EEC, the origins of European integration, Greece, the West of the Mediterranean and the Cold War, the Balkans and the Cold War, several of these she co-edited. She has also written extensively about Greek political parties and Greek foreign policy, the Marshall Plan, Americanization, anti-Americanism, European integration, and transatlantic relations. But for me, the most important thing is as a colleague whenever I have the chance to either talk with her or listen to her. Unfailingly, I learn something new. So with great interest, the floor is yours, Professor Boutou.
Thank you very much for this kind introduction, Iris. Thank you for the invitation. I'm delighted and very honored to be here among these exclusive panelists. And I'm also delighted to have the word right after the important announcement by Tim Sfakianakis regarding the new name of the University of Piraeus. And I hope this will go very fast. Well, my expertise is in modern history, as you all know, and I will borrow the words of an authority in Cold War history, John Lewis Gaddis, who wrote, among others, a famous book entitled On Grand Strategy. There, he points out that the Battle of Salamis united Athens and Piraeus into an island. It created an island out of Athens. He also points out that the Battle of Salamis turned the maritime life of the city into a naval strategy. Thereon, Athens was irrevocably connected with the Aegean Sea, as well as with the Black Sea and the Near East. Sea command became the geopolitical center of gravity, not only for Athens, but for Hellenism as a whole, since most city-states joined the Delian League under the leadership of Athens after that. Victory at Salamis changed political identities as well. It proved that military supremacy was absolutely compatible with democratic governance. Moreover, it proved that democracy was perhaps the best political system to have sea preponderance. And that was something new. That coupling revolutionized political and strategic thought ever since. Until Salamis, people didn't really believe that democracy could win wars. Military might was connected with land forces, an oligarchy or aristocracy. Sparta, with its formidable professional warriors, was the obvious hegemon in the Hellenic world. Athens held position number 2 in defense matters. Its magnetism was owed much more to an open public life, to creativity and democracy and freedom. To most Athenian aristocrats, the division of labor was barely unwelcome because it helped them sustain their privileges and be primus inter pares in the decision-making processes. Land forces were provided by noble landowners who could afford to give soldiers and horses. Dependence on Sparta was less onerous than the potential radicalization favored by Athenian Democrats. Well, one of those radical Democrats was Themistocles, the architect of the battle and the victory at Salamis. Themistocles tied his radical political ideas with his preference for naval armaments. He actually realized that ambition when he undertook a very important naval program right after the debacle of the Ionian Revolt in 493, in order to help Athens deal with the next challenges coming from the east. As Plutarch said, he fastened the city to Piraeus and the land to the sea as early as before the Battle of Marathon. In Themistocles' eyes, the future of Hellenic warfare was naval, and the future of Greek identity, of Hellenic identity, was maritime. So the future of Athens, in order to achieve all that, had to be democratic. Initially, the Persian attack confirmed the priority of armed forces. The Athenian aristocrats had been prepared quite well for that and fought almost alone with some help from Platyas, but without the Spartans. And they maintained the traditional social structure and the agricultural character of Athens. But something was already changing in the darkest hour. In fact, the Marathon battle prepared the ground for Salamis 10 years later, because everybody sensed that the Persians would come back for revenge. The Battle of Salamis, as said before, was a paradigm shift. As Barry Strauss noted in his fascinating way, it was a people's war. Everybody counted for victory. Class, economic status, or land ownership were less decisive than bravery, namely character. As Themistocles replied to a provocative Corinthian delegate, The city's power lay not within the walls, but in her 200 fully manned ships. Victory at Salamis precipitated democratization based on sea command. Athens built a mighty pan-Hellenic alliance and reinvented itself. The long walls offered protection and a way out to both city and harbor. The Acropolis commemorated the great victories through eternal stone monuments. Looking at Salamis, actually Propylaea are framing Salamis. Epitaphs and theater plays shaped memorial communities around collective memories. Everything in the public sphere provided citizens and allies with an image of the common past and a design for the common future. It's no exaggeration to say that the miracle of classical Athens was firmly rooted in the Battle of Salamis. Well, that miracle was destroyed by the Peloponnesian War. And the Peloponnesian War cannot be separated from Salamis. Actually, the new spirit that came out of it was perceived as a vital threat by the Spartans and their allies, especially maritime competitors, Corinthians. It was not an easy war for the winners, though. According to recent research, the Spartans managed to prevail only when, in the final years of the war, they cut the Athenians off the seas from which they derived their power, good ships and allies, namely Eastern Aegean and the Hellespont. After the collapse of democratic Athens in 404, democracy disappeared for many centuries. The principle of naval supremacy didn't. Actually, it became a fundament in the empires that followed, the Roman Empire and the Byzantine Empire. The Greeks continued to inhabit the same places, the same territories, and the same waters as before, and their waters were traps again for any potential invaders. The combination of naval power and democracy were rediscovered many centuries later by the republics of Genoa and Venice. Their huge fleets safeguarded democracy at home and maritime trade in the Eastern Mediterranean. However, the most far-reaching comeback was probably the dual impact of European colonialism and European Enlightenment, even if this sounds a little bit odd, because imperialism included not only expansion, but only reaction to that. The American Revolution was a reaction to that. The French Revolution was a reaction to what we knew until that time. And they both irrigated the new Greekness, the new Greek state that was coming up from the Ottoman Empire. At that time, the Acropolis became a symbol, a universal symbol of democracy and freedom, not just a symbol for the Greeks that were rediscovering their past. So the Acropolis became an integral part of the concept of the West, because the concept of the West was coming up at that time. The national awakening of the Greeks went hand in hand with the rediscovery of the shelf in that paradigm that was redrawing maps and ideas around them. The Greek state did not reach the borders of the ancient Athenian state, of the ancient Athenian world. It was much smaller. In order to survive, the War of Independence had to have lower aspirations than in the beginning, when it sought to create a big democracy in the places that the ancient Greeks used to live, like Rigas Ferreros noted in his pioneer work in the end of the 18th century. But it was vital to control Athens and, of course, the islands attached to that, like Coast Guard islands. The revolution did not start in Athens. It started in the Peloponnese, actually, after a small episode in Mordovlachia. But what Salamis used to be for Athens now were the small islands around the Peloponnesian castles, like Hydra, Spetses, Poros, Aegina. They guarded the Peloponnesian castles and they opened the way to recapture Athens, which happened in the end of the revolution, in the end of the war. Again, the sea was the center of gravity. So the modern Greek state imitated, in a way, the ancient Athenian League, the Delian League, in order to have the sea, the islands as center of gravity. And of course, they looked up to Asia Minor as well until 1922. The great powers supported the idea of a modern naval nation state in the Eastern Mediterranean. They didn't support necessarily the idea of a greater Greece. That was a job of the Greeks to do themselves. Through the great idea, their nationalistic program that lasted over 1 century, having again the Aegean as the center of gravity, and looking down to Cyprus, looking to the Anatolian coast, looking up to Macedonia, which is not separate from that, because Macedonia was important in order to protect the Aegean horizontally and vertically. And in the 20th century, Greece again focused through the great wars on taking back the Eastern Aegean islands, the Dodecanese in 1947, and even Cyprus, which underlined the Greekness of the Eastern Mediterranean, or the connection of Greekness with the Eastern Mediterranean. Apparently, it wasn't Russia, the power that in the beginning supported the Greek idea of independence, but sea power England that became the major foreign influence in the Greek state. And the one that gave Greece also the Ionian Islands again in 1864. After 1947, it wasn't England anymore, but the new great naval power of the Eastern Mediterranean, namely the US, that became the most important influence in Greece. There is still a heated debate as to whether sea power leads to liberal democracy and vice versa. Well, in the case of modern Greece, the two weren't so synchronized. It took us a long time to reach democracy until well into the 1970s. And actually the national integration wars put us many times to fights, to dictatorships, and even a civil war. There's also a never-ending debate about the cultural affinity between modern Greeks and the ancient Greeks. But there is one similar thing, which is geopolitical identity. And the geopolitical identity is built around the Aegean. Athens is there and definitely an integral part of modern Greek identity. But the idea of Athens was created in Salamis. It was shaped by victory in Salamis. Greek identity is also an important part of identity for the West, as we know it even today after the Second World War, after the Cold War was over. And from this standpoint, the anniversary of the Battle of Salamis this year meets the bicentennial anniversary of the beginning of the Greek Revolution in both geopolitical and ideological terms. Salamis showed what people can achieve in a democracy under visionary leadership. And this is an everlasting legacy for modern Greece and for the modern West. Thank you very much.
Excellent, Costa. That was a great presentation, and I expected no less. Let me just say that some of the points that were raised was that, and this could be a great examination question, by the way, for the students listening. Is democracy the best regime for naval supremacy? What is the connection between naval supremacy and the regime? Does naval supremacy require democracy? Does it help democracy? And then the fascinating, I think, thing in this presentation was the fact that once Themistocles shows in practice the importance of establishing naval supremacy, then subsequent world powers see this, follow this example, and prevail for hundreds of years. They have empires. Finally, there was a fascinating connection between naval supremacy and 1821 and the birth of the modern Greek state. And if I understood you correctly, the connection is twofold. On the one hand, Greece in its struggle aimed to have some kind of local naval supremacy and presence. And secondly, as we established the state and moved on, two of the most important world naval states, the United Kingdom first, and then the United States, played a seminal, integral role in modern Greek history, for better or worse, that we can debate, but that they were important factors that cannot be denied. Finally, and I'm going to steal this, the connection between identity and the geopolitical continuity. I thought you would say language or culture, but you gave the angle of geopolitical continuity around the Aegean as an integral part of Greek identity throughout the ages, which is awesome. Very interesting. So thank you very much. We now turn to Professor Josiah Ober. And boy, will I start with a big complaint here. Professor Ober, great professors are sometimes get to write one magnum opus during their careers. Amazing professors, maybe they write 2 big books, okay? And I was reading this past weekend, Democracy and Knowledge, one of your great books. But for those who know baseball or are in the States and are watching us, with Professor Ober, every single one of his books is either a perfect game or a no-hitter. And you forget Grand Slams, that's for the essays. And I'm jealous. I mean, book after book after book, the bar is set so high. Every single one is a masterpiece. So Professor Josiah Ober is Konstantin Mitsotakis Professor of Political Science and Classics at Stanford University. He previously taught at Princeton and Montana State Universities. He is the author of Demopolis, which is a great book, Democracy Before Liberalism, they're all great books, Before Liberalism in Theory and Practice, The Rise and Fall of Classical Greece, Democracy and Knowledge, Political Dissent in Democratic Athens, Mass and Elite in Democratic Athens, and other books and articles on democracy and on political thought, ancient and modern. It's also a great honor to have you on our panel, and the floor is all yours. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Aristotle. It's a great honor to be among such distinguished academics, to have the dean and the minister here to introduce this. It's a great joy and a great day. So, among the major themes of Herodotus' sprawling histories is Athens' emergence as a military power great enough to defend Greece against the invasion launched by King Xerxes of Persia. The historian draws our attention to a vital decision made in the democratic Athenian Citizen Assembly, a decision that he believed was a turning point in Greek history. In Book 7 of the Histories, in explaining why and how the Greeks defeated the Persians, Herodotus underlines Athens' pivotal role in the victory. I quote, "Had the Athenians been panic-struck by the threatened peril and left their own country, or had they not left it but remained and surrendered themselves to Xerxes, none among the Greeks would have attempted to withstand the king by sea, and resistance on land would have been futile. As it is, to say that the Athenians were the saviors of Hellas is to hit the truth. It was the Athenians who held the balance. Whichever side they joined was sure to prevail. Choosing that Greece should preserve her freedom, the Athenians roused to battle the other Greek states, and after the gods, they were responsible for driving the king off. Nor were they moved to desert Hellas by the threatened oracles that came from Delphi and sorely dismayed them, but they stood firm and had the courage to meet the invader of their country." It's Book 7. In this passage, Herodotus argues that the key moment for the Greek war effort came when the Athenians chose not to abandon their homeland. And Herodotus emphasizes that due to their newly built navy, the Athenians had a choice between abandoning Athens and fleeing to someplace in the Western Mediterranean, and on the other hand, staying to fight. Their choice was made democratically by the Athenian citizens gathered in assembly and voting on options. Their democratic process resulted first in the choice to build a navy, and then in the choice to take a stand at sea off Salamis. This becomes the linchpin of history. Those democratic choices determined the outcome of the Persian Wars and thereby set the course for the rest of Western history. If we believe Herodotus, as I think we should, we now live in a world made possible by choices made 2,500 years ago by the democratic citizens of Athens. Herodotus offers a detailed account of the key assembly meeting and its background. When they were faced with Persian invasion, the Athenians sought divine advice. A delegation of citizens was sent to Delphi to consult Apollo. The initial response of the oracle was extremely pessimistic, urging the Athenians to flee to the ends of the earth. But the delegates persisted in demanding a second oracular opinion, and the god's second response seemed to offer a glimmer of hope. He said, the oracle, all will be taken and lost, yet a wooden wall will be granted by Zeus to the Athenians, a stronghold for you and your children. Divine Salamis, you will bring death to women's sons when the grain is scattered or the harvest gathered in. The delegation returned to Athens and reported what they had learned. The recently reformed Athenian Citizen Council discussed the situation and put the question of what to do before an assembly open to all citizens. At least 5,000 or 6,000 men gathered that day on the Pnyx, listened to arguments by trusted speakers, and finally voted to commit Athens' navy to a battle in the Straits of Salamis. Now, in narrating that meeting of the assembly, Herodotus describes a deliberative process in which multiple parties voiced a variety of opinions. Herodotus shows his reader how, in the course of the assembly meeting, the Athenians weighed competing policy alternatives, settled upon a high risk and high payoff policy, and immediately began to carry it out. I quote, once again, Book 7, Herodotus, when the messengers had left Delphi and laid the oracle before the demos, the people of Athens, there were many opinions seeking to explain its actual meaning. Among them were two that were especially noteworthy. Some of the elder men said that the god's answer signified that the Acropolis should be saved by building a wooden wall. But others supposed that the god was referring to their warships. Now, they called for those to be fully equipped and nothing else. Yet those who believed their ships would be the wooden wall were confounded by the last verses of the oracle, the ones about the death of women's sons. For the expert readers of oracles, the Kresmologoi, took the verses to mean that if they offered battle by sea near Salamis, the Athenians would be overthrown. So Herodotus carefully notes the variety of policy options that were presented. Flee to the west, per the first oracle, that was the preferred option of the expert oracle interpreters. Or a land-based policy centered on the Acropolis, that was advocated by elders. Or confront the Persians with Athens' new navy. Now, the very survival of Athens as a community hung on this decision. The elders urged that by wooden wall, Apollo literally meant a fence around the sacred Acropolis. Others, however, countered that Apollo had been speaking metaphorically, that wooden wall referred to the recently constructed warships. But the expert oracle interpreters warned that the line about divine Salamis bringing death meant that Athens would be defeated should they risk a naval engagement. In democratic political order, there would not have been a consequential public debate on the oracle's answers. A king, perhaps advised by a small council, would make the decision. In a traditional Greek civic regime like Sparta, the authoritative opinion of elders, backed by the acknowledged experts in oracular interpretation, would have ended the discussion. But Herodotus' detailed account lets his readers see that in democratic Athens, things were done very differently. Because Athenian deliberations were conducted in accord with the fundamental value of isegoria, the equal right to public speech, because each individual citizen had an equal vote on the three options, the opinions of elders and oracular experts failed to decide the matter. Herodotus allows his reader to see that the Athenian system of decision-making was at once majoritarian and rationally cooperative and based on the gathering and sifting of diverse sources of information. No plan could be adopted in democratic Athens until a majority of those in the assembly believed it was the best plan among all available options. Best, that is, for themselves as individuals and best for their community. So how did they decide what information was available to the demos other than the oracles? The relatively wealthy hoplite infantrymen, who made up perhaps a third of the citizen population, must have recognized after the pass at Thermopylae had been turned that there was no hope that an Athenian land army could fight in the open field against the massive forces commanded by the Persian king. Unless they were willing to follow the lead of the traditionalist elders and suffer a doomed siege behind an improvised wooden fence, they had no land-based strategy that would save Athens. Meanwhile, many of the poorer Athenians, who had been training as rowers since the construction of a new navy a few years before, knew a lot from personal experience about the operational capacity of the newly built warships. Their interests would be advanced by a naval victory. Service in a successful navy offered poor men a chance to live better lives, perhaps to share in plunder, but more important, to share in the public honors uniquely available to those who risk their lives in defense of their community. But those eager to fight at sea were held back by the oracle's grim prediction of doom. At this impasse, Themistocles stood up to challenge the elders' and experts' interpretation of Delphic information. Themistocles argued that, and I quote Herodotus, the expert readers of oracles had incorrectly interpreted the whole of the oracle, and he, Themistocles, reasoned that if the verse referring to the death of women's sons really pertained to the Athenians, it would have been formulated in harsher language. The oracle would have called Salamis cruel rather than divine, seeing that Athens' inhabitants were to perish. Correctly understood, said Themistocles, the god's oracle referred not to the death of Athenians, but of their enemies. And his advice was that the Athenians should believe their ships to be the wooden wall that would be the stronghold for the Athenians. Well, with Themistocles' interpretation before them, the many Athenians who had reason to believe in the capacity of the fleet to save the state were presented with a way to align their interests, their knowledge of military preparedness, and the religious information provided by the oracle. The infantrymen, for their part, were offered a hope for success and an honorable way out of the suicidal Acropolis defense strategy. They would fight as Marines and stand guard on the shores of Salamis. Fighting a naval battle became a rational choice for the many formerly undecided citizens. The outcome was a near consensus about what was the best policy. Herodotus again, quote, the Athenians judged Themistocles to be a better counselor than the expert readers of oracles, who would have had them prepare for no sea fight, and in short, to offer no resistance at all, but to leave Athens and settle in some other country. Herodotus concludes his account of decision-making before Salamis with a sentence that echoes the formal language of the democratic government. Quote, in their debate, after the giving of the oracular response, they accordingly resolved, ad doxa des They accordingly resolved that they would put their trust in the god and meet the foreign invader of Hellas with the whole power of their fleet, ships and men, and with all other Greeks who were so minded. Herodotus' narrative of the Athenian decision to fight the Persians at sea focuses on the ways in which Athenians sought out information and deliberated about it. The process of deliberation over the meaning of new information was carried out openly, and multiple opinions were offered. Elders were respectfully listened to, specialist experts were consulted, but their interpretation, which did not account for what many in the assembly knew and believed, failed to carry the day. Finally, a speaker offered an interpretation that aligned the religious information with social and technical knowledge about emergent Athenian naval capacity. That interpretation offered a way for the community to act with both courage and reason in its own defense. Were it not for Athens' political order, in which equality among citizens included equality in respect to public speech, the preference of the elders to fight on the Acropolis, conjoined with the expert judgment of the oracle interpreters, would have made Themistocles' intervention completely ineffective. The Athenians would not have fought at Salamis. Some would have fled to the west. After the brave, foolhardy defenders at the Acropolis palisade were slaughtered, Athens would be lost. The rest of Greece would have been absorbed into the Persian Empire. There would have been no 5th century Golden Age, no 4th century reinvention of democracy, no Platonic or Aristotelian political philosophy. The decision to fight at sea at Salamis was, as Herodotus makes clear, the choice that made all that possible. And the choice to fight at Salamis, as he makes equally clear, was the result of democratic procedures. Those procedures were not just about majority rule, but about freedom of speech, equality of influence, the organization of the information essential to making the best possible public decisions. Democracy, demokratia, was, as Herodotus well knew, the name of a form of government that enabled the ordinary people to express their joint capacity for deliberation, for rational choice, for decisive action. The name for a system enabling many citizens with diverse wants and needs to focus on what they most value, to share what they knew and what they believed, to identify and defend the common good. In our own age, and now I'm speaking of my own country, of the United States, in our age of polarized political parties and populists who admire and mimic autocrats, when trust in constitutional procedure is waning, when information is at once superabundant and chaotic, we would do well to reflect on what democracy originally meant to those who first invented it.
Thank you very much, Professor Ober. That was truly masterful and many takeaways, but I think you nailed it when you said Athens had a choice. And not only did it have a choice, it was important that it could have a choice. Choices are not given. But we have to understand that when they were making this choice, they did not know the outcome. Now it's easy for us to say, well, Themistocles was right, he was vindicated, and he was vindicated by history and by specific events. When they were making their decision, they didn't know the outcome. In fact, if we've got to be frank about it, it was likelier that they would not succeed than succeed. And succeed though they did. And listening to your presentation, I can't help but see how important it is and relevant to today. You have a democratic society for its age and time, the most democratic at that time in the world, and they're trying to make a decision that may or may not doom their city, their own personal existence, Western civilization. And you said, You need to have a majority decision. You need to have rationalism. You need to have information. You need to take into account class, interests, and religion. And then I think, although you didn't spell it out, there's one other ingredient that Athens was very fortunate to have that democracies don't always, and that is meaningful, brilliant leadership, hence Themistocles. So thank you very much. That was excellent. We'll turn now to Professor Platyas. Before that, let me just tell those who are actually listening, you can start sending questions. We're going to have a Q&A at the conclusion of our event. So if you want, there's a Q&A or chat option. If you want to send in some questions, it will help me because I'll have time to review them before we end the presentations. So we now turn to Professor Platyas. Professor Platyas is going to get the briefer introduction because, what can I say? He is, thank God, again, the chair of the Department of International and European Relations of the University of Piraeus. And we're number one. He is the Dean of International Relations in Greece. And it's unofficial as it is real. And he's my mentor. And that's all I have to say or need to say. So with that, Professor Platyas, the floor is yours. I've heard a version of what I think you're about to say, and I can't wait to hear it updated and all. So thank you, and the floor is yours.
Wonderful. I'm really delighted to be in this panel. I enjoy all the 4 previous presentations. Actually, they have covered the whole story. There is not that much to add. Professor Ober recited Herodotus. He said everything. So to make a cut for myself, I will try to present the Battle of Salamis through the eyes of Thucydides, to take a different cut. And let me see how Thucydides would have seen the whole thing. Thucydides starts with the archaeology, laying down the concept of the genesis of power, how power is being created. And for him, power is being created by control of the sea, thalassocracy. Control of the sea brings wealth, and then walls protect the fleet and the wealth. So if a city manages to combine these 3 things, the fleet, to generate wealth and protect wealth in the fleet, becomes great. And then he is using that particular analysis to explain the genesis of the Athenian Empire, mostly the 50 years before of the Peloponnesian War. The Petikoideia is applying to this model to Athens and shows how Athens, through the fleet, Thalassocratia, allies brought wealth, and how the walls of Athens protected the fleet and the wealth and provided a security infrastructure to protect the allies. So that's the model of genesis of power and the genesis of empires. And for Thucydides, that was very important to explain the cause of the Peloponnesian War. Now, what is interesting in this structural analysis, the link between strategic decisions made by democratic assemblies, as Professor Robert highlighted, and the structural elements, there is leadership. And the person that he is using as a bridge between archaeology and the 50 years before the Peloponnesian War, which is the rise of the Athenian Empire, is Themistocles. And I was really surprised when I was reading closely Thucydides to see that he gives more credit to Themistocles for the creation of Athens and its strategy and the Golden Age than to Pericles. Pericles actually was his successor in the Democratic Party. And if you see his strategy, essentially, used the resources that Themistocles has created, and he has used it with the same way that Themistocles has used it. So my reading of Thucydides is that Themistocles was essentially an empire builder, was a statesman, and not really a military leader, a statesman, a political leader that transformed an agricultural mid-sized state to a naval empire. Now, how he did this trick, how he did this magic? I will structure my presentation by using characterizations of Thucydides made in favor of Themistocles in order to try to prove Thucydides right. He said Themistocles was characterized by his foresight, characterized by his vision, characterized by his persuasion, characterized by his boldness and risk-taking. He was a man that he could offer solutions fast and at the moment, and was a strategic genius. So I will take these characterizations and try to substantiate it. Foresight. Actually, Themistocles could see the Persians coming even before the Battle of Marathon. At 493, he was elected at the age of 30 supreme leader of Athens. And in order to mobilize the Athenians around on the Persian threat, he sponsored a theater play, The Destruction of Miletus. 3-4 years ago, the Persians had completely destroyed Miletus and killed the population and completely destroyed the city. So Themistocles wanted to show to the Athenians what was coming to them. So he used the social media of his age, which was theater, in order to shock the Athenians. And the shock was so grave that they fined the playwright. Themistocles also started building the walls in Piraeus, but he did not finish the project. Then the Persians invaded. They invaded via the sea. They destroyed Eretria, and then they attacked Athens in Marathon. Marathon was an hoplite affair. The Athenians were successful and started building trophies to celebrate their victory, hoping that the Persians will never come back. Themistocles was driving crazy, telling them the Persians are back and this time they will come with more forces. There is no way to balance such a threat. So you have to transform your city. Of course, the city dominated by land-based aristocracy couldn't hear this argument. So Themistocles has to work slowly to change the political system of Athens from a kind of enlightened democracy that the oligarchs and the aristocrats were running the show to complete democracy. So he took an agenda for almost 10 years of changing the system, sometimes using bold measures like exiling his political opponents. And that allows him to get enough power in order to do the second thing that Thucydides said that Pericles did, persuasion, to persuade the Democratic Assembly to choose between butter and guns, because that was the choice. As Dean Sfakianakis said, when resources were found at Lavrion, the issue was how to divide these resources. And the aristocrats were saying, give it to the population. That's a populist strategy. Themistocles adopted a counter-populist strategy, trying to persuade the democratic crowd, which is very difficult, that it's for their best interest to build guns, ship fleet in that case, in order to withstand the Persian and Aegean from Aegina. He actually used a trick. He said, we have a problem with Aegina, so we have to build the ship. But actually, he was planning to create internal balancing to utilize all kinds of resources in order to be able to balance the threat. So he was sure that the Persians next time will come via the sea, and they would land anywhere that they wanted, and Athens had no hope. So he had a strategic problem of how to turn Athens into a naval city. He used all kinds of tricks. For example, all kinds of innovations, like using the 100 richest family to build the ships and then the state to buy it back, and all kinds of other innovations like trirachia, how to man the ship and keep it going financially. So with all these procedures, prepare Athens for war. If you read closely Machiavelli, his basic argument is, before you go to war, you have to prepare for war. You have to prepare a state for war. That's precisely what Themistocles did. Prepare his state for war, and then he went to war. I mean, it reminds me of Tilly's expression, war make the state, and the state make war. So the Athenians, to make war, they had to make the state in order to be able to war. And Themistocles was the catalyst. Okay, Thucydides said he was bold, boldness. Professor Ober described the strategic choice of the Athenians to flee, as the Delphi oracle said, in the end of the world, to fight a complete battle in the land, or to evacuate Athens. It was very bold to evacuate the city and try to regain the city in a single battle in Salamis. Now imagine the risk that he was taking persuading the Athenian population. Imagine what would have happened if the Athenians have lost, and what would have been the position of Themistocles in history. So he took a huge personal risk. And as Thucydides said, the Athenians were fighting in Salamis for a city that did not exist. Actually, Athens had been burned already when the Battle of Salamis happened. So the Athenians were trying to regain their city. So the whole incident of how to regain the city via the sea is really the birth of geopolitics. It's for first time that we have seen in history the use of sea power to beat a superior land power. And actually, to return to Herodotus, he quotes Themistocles in the war debate before Salamis, when he was challenged that he was a leader with no city. He said, as long as I have 200 ships, I have a city. That's the genesis of sea power. Actually, when Pericles said, when you control the sea, you control the world, the origin, it's on precisely what I said of Themistocles. Now, let me turn to the characterization of Themistocles by Thucydides as strategic genius. Look, he made all kinds of tricks. First of all, he lured the Persians into the straits. Nobody really knows what kind of message sent to the Persians. I mean, there is a lot of speculation what was the element of the message. Whatever the message was, it worked. If I think strategically, he did not say that the Greeks will go away, try to take the advantage. It did not make sense. The Persians would have opened some pains if the Greeks were dividing themselves. So probably he said something else that made the Persian authorities to run to Salamis, and actually they divided their fleet. The Egyptian fleet of 300 ships went to the other side of the Salamis. He used also another stratagem. After the Battle of Salamis, he threatened the life of the Persian king when he said that the Athenians will cut his connection in Hellespontos. So he made him run with most of his forces away, which means that the next battle, 1 year later, was already decided in Platyas, was decided by the trick of Themistocles. But also he used another tricks, actually even to deceive his own compatriots. I mean, I agree with Professor Robert that Herodotus said precisely what he described, but my own understanding, knowing the mind of the strategic way that Themistocles' mind was working, I don't think that the second position of the oracle was just a divine intervention. I think it was a Themistocles intervention, because the oracle said to the Athenians, go in the end of the wall. And then they started saying something about wooden walls and something about Salamis, precisely what Themistocles wanted to persuade the Athenian crowd, the Athenian population, the Athenian demos. So even there, I think, he used a trick. Now let me go on his strategic genius, how he managed to beat the Persians, how the David beats the Goliath. And that's a clear case that the David managed to beat the Goliath. You don't eat the elephant in one go. You cut it in small pieces. That's precisely what Themistocles did. First of all, he made sure that the land forces, which was the superior element of the Persian fort, was not involved. They were actually watching what happened in Salamis and not being involved. The only small involvement was in Thermopylae. Second, he managed, as I said, to divide the fleet in Salamis by sending 200 ships in the other side that were actually not involved in the battle, and also reduce the Persian fleet in Artemision a month ago, when the Thermopylae battle was taking place. A bigger battle actually took place in Artemision. So actually the Persians there lost about 1/3 of their fleet. So he kept reducing their fleet. And in Salamis, he lured them into the straits, and the straits reduced the numerical superiority. So actually at the point of the battle, it was equal. And most importantly, he blocked the straits, so the Persian ships started hitting each other, and they actually self-destruct. And something most importantly, he used propaganda to instigate revolt of the Ionian contingent of the Persian. And this made the Persians and the Phoenicians very not to trust the Ionians. And when trouble started in Salamis for them, and the Phoenician leaders complained to the Persian king that the Ionians were betraying their cause, he turned against the leaders of the Phoenician ships. He killed the leaders, which make the Phoenician fleet, was the most important part of the Persian fleet, to flee away. So even after the end of the Battle of Salamis, he would have had numerical superiority to make a second try. But through this stratagem of Themistocles, the Persian leader did not have a choice. The Phoenician ships were gone away, and then the other part of the fleet followed. So he essentially used the strategy of completely dividing the forces of the opponent. He was trying to multiply his forces and divide the force of the opponents. Now, I will finish with presenting Themistocles as an empire builder. Which were the elements, the tangible elements of the Athenian empire? Were the fleet that Themistocles built, based on the protection that this fleet was providing against the Persians. The Athenians managed to have allies. Allies in the fleet were creating wealth. And then through against Themistocles' strategies, he made war around Athens and Piraeus, and his successor Pericles connected all these things. So these four tangible elements that Themistocles created were the material element of the Athenian power. But on top of these tangible things were the intangible, and the intangible was strategy. The strategy, the bold strategy. Pericles used the same bold strategy himself in the walls for what Themistocles has done. And then seamanship, ναυτική τέχνη. And the last of the intangible is organization. Professor Robert has written a wonderful essay about the technology of power that he described in detail how Athens was organized. So what I'm trying to suggest is that Themistocles was a critical link between structural forces and the democratic assembly and the strategic choice, because the strategic choice was made by leaders. And I come to leadership. Leadership in ancient Greece was strategy and execution. Unlike the modern corporation that a unit is making strategy and the chief executive officer is implementing it, Themistocles was making this strategy and he was executing it. And he was there on the battle, fighting, when his opponent, the Persian king, was on the top of the mountain watching a theater performance in front of him. So that shows something about leadership. Now, concluding, I would like to raise some more general conclusions out of the Salamis affair. First of all, it's possible that David to beat the Goliath. Now, if you read the literature, when David beats the Goliath, they say, ha, the Goliath did not play his hands correctly. For example, the Americans, when they lost in Vietnam, they made strategic mistakes. So it's not that David beat them, but Goliath lost. Here it's a case that David, Themistocles, beat them. The second thing that I would like to say, that strategy is a force multiplier for sure, but also it works better if you divide the opponent. My third conclusion is democracy is a strategic weapon, and Themistocles was the first to use the strategic weapon. As Professor Roberts said, in Marathon, only the hoplites, 1/3 of the population was utilized. In Salamis, the whole male population could not even man the 200 ships. They had 220, and they gave 20 to some of their allies to man. They had more ships than men, but they use all the available manpower. This utilization of manpower made the difference. Another lesson that Professor Bociu highlighted, that control of the Aegean is vital for Greece. And my last conclusion is strategy is not really what instruments you have to use in a war or in preparation of war, which is usually the definition of a strategy. Strategy starts one level before to prepare the state for war, to create the resources, diplomatic, economic, military for war. And that's the genius. Actually, Machiavelli tried to make this point several centuries ago. And actually, strategy starts from budget. How you divide between investment for the future, barter, consumption, or guns, preparation for dealing with threats. And Themistocles took the unpopular position, trying to persuade the Athenians, instead of making a party and dividing the resources that livelihood generated, to take the long-term perspective, to build the ship. That's why I think Thucydides rightly characterized as the most important leader described in the Peloponnese, in his history of the Peloponnesian War. And he discussed many important leaders, from Archidamos to Pericles, to Hermocrates, to Brasidas. On top of all this is Themistocles. So I'm delighted that the Senate of my university has started the discussion to honor this great statesman, and not just military leader, which understood the strategic value of Piraeus by honoring him the way that they should. Thank you very much.
Bravo.
That was excellent, but it was expected to be excellent. Let me just point out that in the three previous presentations, we had and it was not planned, but we had the following succession of levels of analysis. With Professor Botu, naval sea power, almost like the third level of analysis. With Professor Ober, decision-making, second level of analysis, and Professor Platyas, focusing on Themistocles, that is the first level of analysis. Obviously, everyone included more aspects, but that was the major focus. So we're covering a lot of ground. And we moved from Herodotus to Thucydides. A few takeaways. Themistocles is not just the empire builder, but really the founder. Machiavelli should have included him with Cyrus and Moses and Romulus and the other founders. And Professor Platyas argued that Themistocles had foresight, boldness, strategic genius, and he was willing to actually take the unpopular position because he thought that this was what was good for the state. The national interest went beyond mere popularity. And that's, as Professor Platyas said, not easy. And we have a similar debate today in Greece, going out of a big crisis. Do we spend more on armaments? Do we spend more on education, on health? These are not answers that are easily given. What is certain is what is easy is to find out what is popular. What is difficult is to go the path that is hard. And I'm also going to take as a takeaway that democracy is a strategic weapon, which in the late 20th and early 21st century, a lot of international relations have thought about, do democracies fight with each other? Do democracies tend to win wars, lose wars? This is actually very current, but it starts a long time ago. Let me say also that I'm getting a lot of some excellent questions. So we'll have at least 4 excellent questions at the end, and maybe more, but I've actually, and if you want to send out some more questions, please do. Now we turn to President Chrysostomos Nikias, who is currently President Emeritus and Life Trustee of the University of Southern California, Go Trojans, the holder of the Malcolm H. Curie Chair in Technology and the Humanities, the director of the USC Institute for Technology and Naval Higher Education. He has been at USC since 1991, and in addition to his work as a professor, has served as a center director, dean of the engineering school, provost, and of course, president of the university. Dr. Nikias is a member of the National Academy of Engineering, a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, an associate member of the Academy of Athens, a foreign member of the Russian Academy of Sciences, a life fellow of the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers, and a charter fellow of the National Academy of Inventors. And this is the super abridged CV. But let me say, more importantly, as far as I'm concerned, is that President Nikias is a Renaissance man. He is also a recipient of an honorary doctorate from our university. And during the past 3 years, he has given 2 public lectures at Piraeus. One was on ancient leadership, focusing on Xenophon and the Cyropaedia. And then 2 years later, it was on online education. So that is what a true Renaissance man looks like in the 21st century. And today, I think we're going to we heard about the cities and Herodotus. The floor is now belongs to President Nikias and Aeschylus. Thank you.
Professor Jabiris, thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this panel. And this Vaginagis, thank you for the invitation. It's always a pleasure being associated with the University of Piraeus, and of course participating in this distinguished panel. Since I am the engineer of the panel, you have to allow me to use a PowerPoint presentation. So, and I'm going to put it on the screen for everybody to see. And we all heard that the Battle of Salamis transformed the Athenian democracy. But for our American audience, I just wanted to remind you that the Battle of Salamis is the ancient equivalent of the American Revolution, Civil War, and World War II combined. And one of our founding fathers, John Adams, is considered the father of the United States Navy. And actually, John Adams was referring to the first ships of the United States Navy as the wooden walls of the Republic, using the Themistocles or the Delphi Oracle expression before the Battle of Salamis. So what I'm going to talk about here, it's a Greek tragedy that was written and staged by Aeschylus, the first Greek tragedian, one of the great, called the Persians. And Aeschylus perhaps authored the earliest and the most audacious work within the great artistic tradition of a democratic dialogue. So let's imagine that only 8 years after the Battle of Salamis, in 472 BC, Aeschylus presented Athenians with this tragedy, the Persians, asking them to identify with the defeat, the pain, the humiliation of an empire, asking them essentially to identify with hubris, the overconfidence, the self-pride, and the arrogance that led to their downfall. So in this particular play, Aeschylus is empathizing with the enemy. And we have to remember that Aeschylus was a veteran of the Persian Wars. He fought in the Battle of Marathon and perhaps in the Battle of Salamis. And also he lost his brother in the Battle of Salamis. But he insisted the inscription of his gravestone made a reference to the fact that he was a veteran of the Battle of Marathon. So Aeschylus in the Persians provides an empathetic narrative of their loss, calling the Athenians to identify with hubris. And of course, the play is staged, the scene is in the court of the king Xerxes at Susa. And the plot is essentially begins with Xerxes' mother, the queen Atossa's bad dream. There is the arrival of the messenger with his narrative of the Persian defeat. There is, of course, the ghost of King Darius, Xerxes' father, rising from the underworld and raging on his son's arrogance. And then at the end, there is the arrival of the disgraced King Xerxes. But Aeschylus in this play demonstrates a remarkable ability to describe the Battle of Salamis from the eyes of the enemy, from the eyes of the Persians. And he describes this battle with deep compassion in terms of the suffering of the Persians during the battle, but also afterwards. So by doing so, this great tragedian Aeschylus began a grand tradition in which artists confront their audiences in a democratic society, challenging them to consider carefully the moral paradoxes in successfully defending liberty. When democracy, as we know, is in battle with other ideologies, this artistic tradition is vital for our own societal democratic well-being. So, in most of the works of art that they talk about war, the artist portrays the enemy as an amorphous evil, as a beast of a stereotype character. However, Aeschylus, as a veteran of the Persian wars, had the courage to empathize with the enemy, to portray the opposition as flesh and blood mortals with the full range of human hopes and fears and suffering. And let's remember, in the audience in 472 BC, there were heroes and veterans of the Persian wars. The audience, they all lost their homes 8 years later when the Persians burned it to the ground. But nevertheless, the audience awarded Aeschylus their first prize. And as a matter of fact, Aeschylus acted in the play. He played the role of Xerxes, he played the role of the messenger, and he also played the role of the ghost, King Darius. And the producer, the so-called chorigos of the tragedy, was a young man by the name Pericles of Xanthipus. So this grand artistic democratic tradition, empathizing and humanizing the enemy that began by Aeschylus, has been reverberating since then through centuries, all the way to our own times. We see this grand democratic tradition that was followed by Euripides, when in the midst of the Peloponnesian War in 415 BC, and only shortly after the siege of Milos by the Athenians and the massacre that took place, Euripides staged before his Athenian audience the tragedy, the Trojan Women, where he asked the Athenians to essentially identify with the tears and griefs of Troy's women mourning for their lost husbands, and for them and their children becoming slaves, because that's exactly what the Athenians did less than 9 months earlier to the inhabitants of the island of Delos. We see this tradition in the 2nd century BC, for example, where a Jewish playwright, Ezekiel, wrote a tragedy where depicting the Jewish exodus from Egypt with Moses, where the Egyptian army is portrayed as the Persians and the Moses, his followers, as the ancient Greeks and the freedom-loving Athenians. We see Aeschylus is the Persians and different adaptations and metaphors in the European Renaissance and the Enlightenment movement. And after the naval battle of Lepanto, which by the way did take place in straits again of Greece, but on the western side, in 1571. So we see this play being revived, celebrating the victory of the Western European alliance fleet against the Ottomans. And of course, the Ottomans are portrayed as they were the Persians, and the Western European fleet, the alliance of Venice, Genoa, Spain, and Austria, as the freedom-loving Athenians. But we also see influences of Aeschylus in Marlowe, in Milton, in Shelley, in Byron. And in our own times, the legendary Greek theater director Carolus Koun staged the Persians in the mid-60s in London, where at that time he portrayed the king of Greece and the extreme right wing as the invading Persians from within. And of course, as the Greek population, the freedom-loving Athenians. And Carolus Koun was very prophetic at the time because with his adaptation, because 1 year later, after he staged this play, the military junta took over in Greece. But we also see it by another brilliant theater director, Musanidis, who staged in Epidavros in 1971 the Persians in the midst of the Greek military junta. And in order to avoid censorship, he did stick to the original text. But however, to his audience watching this tragedy in Epidavros, Xerxes was the metaphor of the military junta as the man with blind ambition that brings their downfall. And of course, the audience was the loving freedom people fighting against, in quotation marks, the Eastern invaders. So this resonance, especially in the last 3 decades of Aeschylus, we see it again and again and again from the early 90s all the way to 2020. The Persians has become very, very trendy given the United States and Western alliances involvement in the Middle East. So what we see here, it was the invasion, the first war with Iraq in 1991. There has been the war in Afghanistan, and then the second invasion of Iraq in 2003. So just imagine from 2003 to 2008, over a period of 5 years, in the United States alone, Aeschylus's The Persians was staged more than 30 times. And the question is, why? Well, let's look at the plot. It's an invading superpower. There is a hubris displayed by the leaders of this superpower to conquer a minor enemy on the periphery of the empire that his grandfather failed a decade earlier. As Professor Platyas said, in the Battle of Salamis, Themistocles made sure that sent over to the Persians bad intelligence. So there is a bad intelligence involved here. Remember the weapons of mass destruction intelligence, the second Iraq war. There is, again, Professor Platyas pointed out, it's a David-Goliath analogy. And there is a failed military invasion. So the anti-war theater loves the Persians plot. It is no surprise. And in our own times, a play was staged in 1993, shortly after the first Iraq War, by Peter Sellers, right here in LA at the Mark Tabor Forum. And I had the opportunity to see the play when it was staged, where Saddam Hussein and the Iraqis were the Persians. That's the metaphor he used. And the American alliance were the victorious Athenians. So in this adaptation, it wasn't really the David-Goliath relationship. However, it is no surprise that most of the critics crucified Peter Sellers staging the play with this metaphor. However, he went out of his way to focus on the pain that was inflicted on the Iraqi population. There was also Ellen McLaughlin's adaptation that was staged many, many times across the United States of the Persians, especially after the 2000 3 American invasion of Iraq, where the Americans in this case are the invading Persians and the Iraqis are the outnumbered Athenians. And even in our own times, our own professor here at the University of Southern California, famous writer Percival Everett, who is my daughter's favorite teacher, in about 15 years ago in his novel Erasure, that he portrays a fictional reviewer criticizing a fictional African-American author. And of course, there is the expression, what this reworking of Aeschylus, the Persians, has to do with the African-American experience, which of course he explains in this novel. And finally, in my humble opinion, in terms of a Hollywood director, Clint Eastwood followed Aeschylus's tradition by filming a movie where he was humanizing the enemy. The same year, 2006, Clint Eastwood introduced 2 films at once, The Flags of Our Fathers and The Letters from Iwo Jima. And both of them were based on one of the most grueling battles of World War II, the Battle of Iwo Jima. In The Flags of Our Fathers, he gives the American view of the battle, where the enemy, Japan, is this amorphous evil beast. And then in the second movie, The Letters from Iwo Jima, he gives the battle from the Japanese point of view, where the Japanese soldiers are the mortals with the hopes and the fears, flesh and blood mortals with the hopes and the fears of any other human being. So he's humanizing the enemy. And let me remind you that over a period of 5 weeks in this battle, more than 25,000 people lost their lives, and another 20,000 people were captured. It was one of the most grueling battles of World War II. But in my opinion, in this particular movie, Clint Eastwood stepped forward as the next in the great line of classicists who understood the full power of the arts to display the humanity of an enemy. But to replicate exactly Aeschylus's context in our age, imagine that instead of John Wayne's triumphant Sons of Iwo Jima that was being released in 1949, that it was Clint Eastwood's movie Letters from Iwo Jima that was released instead. So in summary, Aeschylus's grand democratic tradition has been reverberating through centuries since the Battle of Salamis, reminded us as citizens of a democracy that even when we disagree with an artist, we are reminded how healthy disagreements demonstrate our advantage in a democratic society over closed societies. Thank you.
Very much, President Nikias. I need a few moments just to absorb everything that you said. I think one thing you made absolutely clear beyond any doubt, that this battle has, and the Persians as a tragedy are truly timeless. Ktima Esai, a possession of all times, is what the cities calls his own history, if it's a history, because it's more than that. And it means that what we're dealing with are issues, plays, archetypes, situations that transcend the 5th century, and really go all the way to talking to us in the 21st century, as they will no doubt in the coming century as well. This is the whole point of something being truly timeless. Now, as I said, I need some more time to absorb this. Thank you very much. I have, through various mediums, I've received a number of questions. I will choose only a few, and I will ask all of you can have a dig to any one of these questions or all of them, and I'm going to lump them together. Remember, a big chunk of our audience are students, so a number of them asked you to clarify a little bit more the what if. What if this had gone the other way? When you say the West would have been different, can anyone touch a little bit more about this? What exactly would have been different if the Greeks had been defeated?
Professor Robert should answer this question.
Sure.
He actually started answering, but I would love him to extrapolate a little more.
Let me just get them all in. A great question. We had, well, now we have references to Herodotus, Thucydides, Aeschylus, and I guess Plutarch. Are they all on the same page, or do they actually differ on how they view the Battle of Salamis? This is interesting. This could be a great exam question, even a graduate exam question. Professor Hila, our dear colleague who has come to our department very recently, do you believe that in our times leadership is able to navigate today's challenges? So we've learned a lot. It's a long question, but that's the crux of it. How do you see contemporary leadership, say in our countries, the United States and Greece, compared to the leadership you're talking about 2,500 years ago? Another question, this more to Professor Platyas, I think. Might China be the next naval, and Professor, might China actually be the next naval superpower? Might the mantle of naval superpower go to China in the 21st century? And I love this question. Are we being a little bit old-fashioned? We hear a lot about men and leadership. What about the women, the slaves? Are we forgetting this part of society in our telling of the Battle of Salamis? Fair enough. So you can all have a go at any question that you want. And Professor Ober, I think Professor Platyas put you on the spotlight. So why don't you start first?
Okay, so what would have been different? And of course, that's the problem with counterfactual history, is we don't really know. We do know it would have been different. Right? I think so. That I think we can agree with that there would have been things would have been very very different. The Persian Empire tended to allow local states a certain amount of autonomy, so we don't have to imagine that. Athens simply would have been, or the Greek world would have been turned into slaves of the Persian king. On the other hand, I think that autonomy was limited. The tradition of democracy as we understand it in Athens would have been over. I don't think the Persians were going to allow that kind of a democratic authority to continue. The tradition of political philosophy, which I alluded to, is really in dialogue with democracy. Greek political philosophy, at least in my view, is simply impossible without imagining it being written in juxtaposition to what was pretty much on the table as the best practical way of organizing society. Plato, Aristotle thought there were other better ways to do it, but they had to argue against why a democracy was not the best. So I think that there would be a lot that we would not have. If we imagine we don't have Plato and Aristotle, at least in any sort of form of that we now understand them, we basically don't have a great deal of the Western tradition, at least philosophical tradition of thought. And without that, I think we're in a very, very different place today. So I can't say exactly what it would look like, but I think we can confidently say that we would be in a world that would be very, very different from what we have now, and maybe a world that would look more like, for example, what if China were the dominant power in the world?
Okay, great. Yes, Professor Nikias.
Uh,
President Nikias.
I would like to comment on the question whether China will be the next naval power and so on. To me, looking ahead into the 21st century and looking the great advances in the area of technology, I honestly believe, and this is my humble opinion, I honestly believe that the equivalent to a naval power that has been extremely important from the Battle of Salamis for 2,500 years to date is not going to be the same in the future. The naval power is going to be the space race. So instead of having naval ships, you're going to have, you will need space ships. The dominance in space is going to replace the need for a very strong navy. As you know, the technology will be there that you're going to get on a plane that as soon as it gets out of our atmosphere, slightly into space, and then comes back, you can travel anywhere in the world in less than 45 minutes, if you were able to do that. So to me, the naval ships will be replaced by space ships. And the nation that has a strong presence in space, that's where the power is going to be projected and reflected.
Fascinating. Professor Platyas.
Well, I don't disagree with Professor Nikias, but I would like to expand the definition of sea power. Now, we are talking about the control of the commons. You see, in the age of Themistocles and Pericles, when you were controlling the sea, you were controlling the commons of that age. Now, the commons, of course, includes the sea, but also above the sea, the air, and also the space. So essentially, the control of the sea has been extended to control of the commons. Now, let me, however, get to the original question, whether China can compete with the United States on this front. Oh, you see, when Archidamos in the Peloponnesian War made an assessment that the Athenians are hard to beat because they were controlling the sea, their allies, the Corinthians, said, oh, don't worry, we will invest in the ships by beat them at sea. It doesn't work that way. Seamanship, as Pericles said, it takes centuries to develop. So even if the Chinese build more ships, and they are building, there is no way to compete with the United States. And I think deeply the Chinese understand that. You see, geopolitics essentially means controlling the sea, you control the world. How you can lose dominance of the sea? If a land power managed to occupy the heart of land power, which is Eurasia, then we'll develop the resources big enough to compete with the dominant sea power, being that the UK or now the United States. So the Chinese, in order to compete with the United States at sea, that they feel very vulnerable, the American fleet can cut their trade any moment that it decides to. They built the One Belt, One Road, which is a kind of land bridge and in a way to dominate to Eurasia. If they dominate in Eurasia, they will have enough resources to compete with the United States at sea. But this takes a lot of if, which means that they will not challenge the United States directly, but through command of huge part of the land. I doubt that this will happen very soon.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Botsiou.
Yes, thank you. I will just say about the what if question that we historians usually do not get into that discussion because we believe there's a lot to discuss regarding what happened, what really happened. But I would like also to point out that the Battle of Salamis or the Battle of Marathon did not happen from scratch. I mean, let's go back to the reasons why the Athenians went to Asia Minor in order to protect populations there, the city-states there, from Persian autocrats, from autocrats protected by the Persians. So democracy was already growing in Athens. Together with strategic thinking, it brought the Athenians on that side of the world. So it didn't just happen suddenly that they took to the weapons and to the sea in order to protect themselves from the Persians. So this is about the what if. It wasn't just a moment in history, but if we see that all as a moment in history, it was very decisive for what happened afterwards. And of course, it's very dark to imagine that perhaps the Persians would have inhabited the Hellenic cities here. Now, about what Professor Nikia said, that's very interesting because in Aeschylus and in some other questions that were posed, we see this contradictory character of the ancient Athenians. They were killers and artists, but they were killers too. And they wanted, they had the courage to criticize themselves for what they had to do in order to protect themselves. This brings us to the women and slaves question. I cannot say much about the slaves, but I can say that women became refugees and they organized actually together with men the exodus of the Athenians from their city for many, many days before the battle happened. Because it was about 3 weeks before the Artemision thing and the Battle of Salamis, and the Athenians had to take the decision and leave the city in an orderly way in order to go to Salamis. So the whole population more or less helped to that. It was a huge mobilization for that time. And some Athenians, of course, came back. Others didn't want to abandon the city, but there was just few of them. So the women were part of that story as well. Regarding the leadership question posed by Professor Hila, I think in order to have leadership, Irene, you need to have good crisis. What you have to do as democracies, if you want to be named democracies, is to prepare characters for good crisis. Because that's what Themistocles invested on, to shape bravery, to shape valor, to shape character, so that he could use all the men and women in his city when the crisis erupted. In order to have that, you need advanced citizenship, you need democracy, you need access to information, free speech, rhetorical competition, dialogue, you need equality, you need rights. So you need a lot of stuff, you need a good educational system in order to provide to people the opportunity to become leaders when crises erupt, and they erupt all the time. We don't have any complaints about that. So I believe that leadership is still going on. We've seen leaders changing the world again and again. Of course, not perhaps of the caliber of Themistocles, who was more or less assessed in the same way as a personality by all those ancient writers that were mentioned, although they disagree in how they see the battle itself or aristocracy that started to build in Athens. So rounding up, I think that by studying the Battle of Salamis, we study leadership, we study strategy, we study ancient history, but we also study modern leadership as well. Thank you.
This is excellent. Might any one of the panelists want to add anything else?
Well, just 2 short comments. I slightly disagree with Professor Ober on what would have happened to the Athenians if they would have lost. Look what happened to Miletos, and look what happened to the Persian Empire after Marathon. You see, it shows that the Persian Empire was weak, and then you had revolutions in Egypt and in other places that what delayed the Persian invasion to Greece by 10 years. Darius was ready to, the father of Xerxes, to invade Greece, but he had to deal with revolutions created by the weakness that the Persians saw in Salamis. So for empires, not only the Persian, brutality is a strategy. You kill badly in order to be an Athenians were lost and they knew that. So at least on that part, I can be certain that the Athenians had a very great future if they had lost. And look what happened to Eretria before Salamis, before Marathon. They killed most of them, and the others, they were enslaved them, and they took them in a place close to Persia in Iraq, which is modern Iraq. So the Persians want to teach by example. And in that case, brutality would have been necessary for them. Now, on the role of women, when Xerxes destroyed Athens, everything was laid down. Themistocles used, even at that case, a democratic advantage. And he took the destruction of the temples and the houses in order to make the walls. He went to Sparta and he placed a stratagem in order not to mobilize against the Athenians, when the whole population, including women, were building the walls that he planned. So women were part of the war effort, not only when they helped moving from Athens to Salamis, but in rebuilding their cities, and most importantly, its defenses on the wall. So that's again the democratic advantage, the strategic advantage of democracy. And the broader theme, which is very relevant today, because democracies are fighting with authoritarian states. It shows that democracy has a future, despite the fact that authoritarian regimes like China or Russia, they use other instruments. Don't underestimate democracies. I think that's one of the lessons that we learned 25 centuries ago.
Thank you very much. I have to say that today's presentations were informative, wide-ranging, complementary, and consistently excellent. So I would like to thank all the hundreds of people who watched us today and who will watch and view the archived version. I would like to thank Minister Zaharakis, Dean Sfakianakis, President Nikias, Professor Bochou, Professor Alber, and Professor Platyas. I found this fascinating, and I need to be thinking about this for quite some time. So thank you, everyone, and thank you for the IT people who helped us. And I hope that this is an example or a reason to continue this conversation. Hopefully in Greece and Piraeus, when we're done with the pandemic, we reconvene and we continue here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.